It was December 1st in the year 1779 that George Washington established his winter quarters at Morristown. General George Washington's army settles into a second season at Morristown, New Jersey on December 1st in 1779. Washington's personal circumstances improved dramatically as he moved into the Ford Mansion and was able to conduct his military business in the style of a proper 18th century gentleman. However, the worst winter of the 1700s, coupled with the collapse of the colonial economy, ensured misery for Washington's underfed, poorly clothed, and underpaid troops as they struggled for the next 2 months to construct their 1,000-plus log house city from 600 acres of New Jersey woodland. Life was similarly bleak for the war-weary civilian population. With an economy weakened by war, household income declined 40%. Farmers faced raids from British and their Indian allies. Merchants lost foreign trade. Even a great victory, such as the capture of British General John Burgoyne's army in October of 1777, led to 7,800 more mouths to feed. As in 1776, the troops were eager to go home, and many did. Although enlistment papers showed 16,000 men in Washington's ranks, only 3,600 men stood ready to accept his commands. Even those remaining were unable to sustain combat since they lacked sufficient horses to move their artillery. With their currency rendered worthless, the army relied upon requisitions from farmers to supply themselves. Military-civilian relations strained under demands on farmers and shoekeepers to sell at a loss, and because of the now professional army's disdain for civilians. Without paper money, Congress could not pay the army. Without fair pay, farmers stopped planting. By spring, the Continental Army stood at risk of dissolution. The British Army faced a similar crisis. Civilians at home no longer shared British King George III's determination to keep the colonies within the empire. They too suffered from lost trade and the increased debt that is endemic to all wars. To fill the royal army, the crown had to tolerate Catholics, which engendered religious violence. The war of attrition was quickly becoming one of contrition for both sides. It was December 1st in the year 1955 in Montgomery, Alabama, that Rosa Parks is jailed for refusing to give up her seat on a public bus to a white man, a violation of the city's racial segregation laws. The successful Montgomery bus boycott, organized by a young Baptist minister named Martin Luther King Jr., followed Parks' historic act of civil disobedience. The mother of the civil rights movement, as Rosa Parks is known by many, was born in Tuskegee, Alabama in 1913. She worked as a seamstress and in 1943 joined the Montgomery chapter of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP. According to a Montgomery City ordinance in 1955, Black Americans were required to sit at the back of public buses and were also obligated to give up those seats to white Americans if the front of the bus was filled up. Parks was in the first row of the black section when the white driver demanded that she give up her seat to a white man. Rosa Parks' refusal was spontaneous, but was not merely brought on by her feet being tired, as is the popular legend. In fact, local civil rights leaders had been planning a challenge to Montgomery's racist bus laws for several months, and Parks had been privy to this discussion. Learning of Parks' arrest, the NAACP and other Black American activists immediately called for a bus boycott to be held by Black citizens on Monday, December 5th. Word was spread by flyers, and activists formed the Montgomery Improvement Association to organize the protests. The first day of the bus boycott was a great success, and that night, the 26-year-old Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. told a large crowd gathered at the church, quote, "The great glory of American democracy is the right to protest for right," unquote. King emerged as the leader of the bus boycott and received numerous death threats from opponents of integration. At one point, his home was bombed, but he and his family escaped bodily harm. The boycott stretched on for more than a year, and participants carpooled or walked miles to work and school when no other means were possible. As Black Americans previously constituted 70% of the Montgomery bus ridership, the municipal transit system suffered gravely during the boycott. On November 13th, in 1956, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down Alabama state and Montgomery city bus segregation laws as being in violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. On December 20th, King issued the following statement, quote, "The year-old protest against city buses is officially called off, and the Negro citizens of Montgomery are urged to return to the buses tomorrow morning on a non-segregated basis," unquote. The boycott ended the next day. Rosa Parks was among the first to ride the newly desegregated buses. Martin Luther King Jr. and his nonviolent civil rights movement had won its first great victory. There would be many more to come. Rosa Parks continued her eternity on October 24th in the year 2005. 3 days later, the U.S. Senate passed a resolution to honor Rosa Parks by allowing her body to lie in honor in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda. It was December 1st in the year 1959 that 12 nations, including our awesome nation and the Soviet Union, signed the Antarctica Treaty, which banned military activity and weapons testing on that continent. It was the first arms control agreement signed in the Cold War period. Since the 1800s, a number of nations, including Great Britain, Australia, Chile, and Norway, laid claim to parts of Antarctica. These competing claims led to diplomatic disputes and even armed clashes. In 1948, Argentine military forces fired on British troops in an area claimed by both nations. Incidents of that sort, together with evidence that the Soviet Union was becoming more interested in Antarctica, spurred the United States to propose that the continent be made a trustee of the United Nations. This idea was rejected when none of the other nations with interest on the continent would agree to cede their claims of sovereignty to an international organization. By the 1950s, some officials in the United States began to press for a more active U.S. role in Antarctica, believing that the continent might have military potential as an area for nuclear tests. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, our nation's 34th president, however, took a different approach. U.S. diplomats working with their Soviet counterparts hammered out a treaty that set aside Antarctica as a military-free zone and postponed settling territorial claims for future debate. There could be no military presence on the continent and no testing of weapons of any sort, including nuclear weapons. Scientific ventures were allowed, and scientists would not be prohibited from traveling through any other areas claimed by various nations. A dozen nations signed the document. Since the treaty did not directly tamper with the issues of territorial sovereignty in Antarctica, the signers included all nations with territorial claims on the continent. As such, the treaty marked a small but significant first step towards U.S.-Soviet arms control and political cooperation. The treaty went into effect in June of 1961 and set the standard for the basic policies that continue to govern Antarctica.
Information documented and divulged on this audio file can be verified on history.com.